Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Dugout. This Black History Month, we wanted to keep it a little light. Yes, this episode we're going to be talking about Afro-pessimism as a school of thought, as a theory, where it places itself in the disciplines of revolutionaries like Prince and where the canon, as we're seeing, is going, and what we feel we can spit on as Black anarchists in the Midwest. Because talk about being in a room for half an hour, feeling funny, and then realizing you're the only motherfucker with melanin. And you're like, this is why this whole function has felt like a little bit of a picnic, and I've been on parade.
Yeah, sometimes you think, oh, I'm in Mansfield, Ohio. I was very interested in doing this episode because as an anarchist and organizer, one of the biggest ways I feel like I started to enter my own ideas about Black anarchism, especially, or like looking at hierarchy, especially through a racialized lens, was Afro-pessimism. I was living in Seattle in 2016 and I just graduated college and I was working this horrible labor organizing job that I got fired from. And I remember going to Left Bank Books all the time in Pike Place Market, which is this leftist bookstore. And I remember reading, Black Seed Journal. I remember reading Crime Think for the first time. And I think reading some of those things started making me want to look up Blackness and radicalism. And I remember around that time I found We're Trying to Destroy the World, which is something I want to pull from later, but it's an interview of Frank B. Wilderson where he breaks down a lot of the basic concepts of Afropessimism. And that's kind of how I entered my understanding of it. But what would be your kind of how you came to Afropessimism or got to know about it?
From my zine printing days, actually, I would print the Afropessimism anthology that had folks, Frank B. Wilderson, Saidiya Hartman, Steve Marinette, Jared Sexton, folks just like writing about Afro-pessimism, and it's like a collection of essays, and we used to print that, like a little half-page brown book, a couple hundred pages. Reading that put Afro-pessimism on my mind, and I don't think I used to talk about it with white anarchists. They were printing the book before I was. Talking with somebody in real life was with you at a house party or something. You know, it was a workshop that you did for podcasting or something at your house. And then we watched YouTube videos. Really? I don't remember that at all. We watched roller coaster. You showed me roller coaster YouTube videos. This is when I realized you were a deep dive YouTuber.
Oh, I showed you the little girls fainting. Oh my God. That's a sign I trust you.
We were watching some video essays because you were like, what do you watch on YouTube? And I was like, I'm about to like kill the vibe of the party by putting on some 26-minute Frantz Fanon French or like some weird thing. And then it was chill. And then we talked about all that stuff. And then Afro-pessimism, I realized that like there's more text. Like Frank B. Wilderson has like their own memoir thing about it. And then like that's Afro-pessimism from the Wildersonian purview, which I feel like I was introduced through him because he's in the article The Vengeance of Vertigo, Aphasia and Abjection in the Political Trials of Black Insurgents. Talk about Balagoon. They talk about how the vertigo and political and social and psychological vertigo that one goes through when you're doing revolutionary shit and you're caught by the courts and it's all a farce. Afro-pessimism is how I've always seen like the vindication of walking into a courtroom and being like, I don't respect your law. You have never respected me, my body, my ancestor, any clan, tribe, any political or social connection has all been nothing but rot or something for you to exploit. This essay brought like a historical going through court cases, and especially they went through a lot of Balagoon's court cases as well, which Balagoon wrote about themselves. There's transcriptions of when the Black insurgent or revolutionary reaches that vertigo, but that sort of vertigo or like psychological is in the white mind a lot, like that cognitive dissonance. They just function off that shitty culture. The essay starts off with a Frantz Fanon quote from Wretched of the Earth, and it's, and who can affirm that vertigo does not haunt the whole of existence? Just like, what do we do with those points of transition or of uneasy? And what structures and support networks have we built actually maintained?
I like that you mentioned that quote because I like the all of existence, because that to me is a very foundational kind of way that I began to understand and look at Afro-pessimism when I started reading about it. And I was like, what the hell is it talking about? What is this Frank B. Wilderson man saying? Because so much of it is so academic, so confusing. All these big words, ontological, libidinal, but pathological.
FYI, libidinal economy is just the sexual economy.
Okay, I was gonna have to ask that question again.
Yeah, no, we talked about that when we were with some comrades, and that is like, I've been thinking about it way too complicated for too long, because that's just what it's situated in. Like, the context of Afro-pessimism to me is a little, it's not highbrow, but it is like, it belongs on a Harvard, law,
I will also say, when you were saying like, we don't gotta respect your laws, I was kind of thinking in my mind, there's a Venn diagram of Afro-pessimism and sovereign citizenship and hoteps, and they all could meet in the middle. And so I do think it is a meta theory that gives way to certain kind of areas of blackness where they are kind of like, fuck this, fuck that, I don't need to respect anyone, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, you have to be accountable to community in some way. And I think academia does encourage people to kind of stray away from that. And I don't know, it is kind of interesting because I'm like, why is this meta theory sort of applicable to these other areas of blackness that are kind of weird? And I guess that just means like, it's a framework that allows you to look at the world in a certain way. It isn't necessarily a guidance in how you should liberate yourself.
It sounds like it's Unc at the cookout, sitting there mad at the world.
I mean, saying the Jews own the banks, the Chinese are buying up all our roads.
And you just gotta hit them with the, can you cite a source, Unc? Unc, do you know what that means? Please. And then you pull that out, and then it's got like 1.5k views. The comments are literally like, free Hillary. Hillary's been in jail the whole time. Random shit. And it's just like, Unc, what the fuck are you doing? Yeah. Anyway, that's my intro to Afropessimism.
Just the fact that we're going off the dome about all these different reactions to it, I think just, at least to me, shows that I like that it's something that I can engage with almost any black person about, and they will have some kind of perspective, and that perspective will be informed by a lot of different things. So to really enter this discussion, I kind of want to break down a bare bones definition of what Afropessimism is and break down some of the qualities of it. To start, Afropessimism stands as a critical theoretical framework within contemporary discourse, shedding light on the persistent structures of oppression and anti-blackness embedded within society. At its core, Afropessimism challenges conventional notions of progress and liberation by asserting that anti-blackness is not merely a byproduct of systemic inequality, but rather its foundational logic. This perspective emphasizes the unique and enduring nature of black suffering, arguing that black people exist in a state of perpetual social death, a condition that they are excluded from the full rights and recognition afforded to other members of society. Afropessimism suggests that traditional avenues for social change, such as the civil rights movement or legislative reforms, ultimately fail to address the foundational anti-blackness that underpins society.
The New Left Review, Afro-pessimism is a radical abdication by Loic Wacquant. Quote, to the narrative of radical progress, Afro-pessimism counterposes an anti-humanist vision in which the denial of black humanity is everywhere built into the very makeup of civil society. Afro-pessimism gives us the freedom to say out loud what we would otherwise whisper or deny. That no blacks are in the world, but by the same token, there is no world without blacks. The violence perpetuated against us is not a form of discrimination, it is a necessary violence, a health tonic for everyone who is not black. And that sort of precise feelings about that sort of precise discipline in the school of thought does come a lot from the absolutism presented in Frank B. Wilderson's book, Afropessimism, in which he goes on to kind of explain in that thought, quote, black people embody, which is different from saying we are always willing or allowed to express, a meta-aporia. Okay, meta-aporia, that's a key word. For political thought and action. For most critical theorists writing after 1968, the word aporia is used to designate a contradiction in a text or theoretical undertaking. For example, Derrida suggests that aporia indicates, quote, a point of undecidability which locates at the site of which the text most obviously undermines its own rhetorical structure, dismantles, or deconstructs itself. But when I say that black people embody a meta-aporia for political thought and action, the addition of that prefix, meta, goes beyond what Derrida and the post-structuralist meant. It raises the level of abstraction, and in doing so, raises the stakes. In epistemology, which is a branch of philosophy concerned with the theory of knowledge, the prefix meta is used to mean about, or its own category. Metadata, for example, is data about data. Who produced the data? When? What format is the data in? And so on. In linguistics, a grammar is considered as being expressed in a meta-language, language operating on a higher level of abstraction to describe properties of the plain language and not itself. Meta-discussions is a discussion about discussion, not any one particular topic of discussion, but discussion itself. In computer science, a theoretical software engineer might be engaged in the pursuit of meta-programming. Afropessimism, then, is less of a theory, and it's more of a meta-theory. It's a critical project that, by deploying blackness as a lens of interpretation, interrogates the unspoken and assumption of logics of Marxism, post-colonialism, psychoanalysis, and feminism through rigorous theoretical consideration of their properties and assumptive logic, such as their foundations, methods, form, and utility.
I'm actually laughing because you were reading
You want me to just finish it off?
Yeah, just finish. We were going to switch off on reading this definition. This is a critique of Afro-pessimism that reading the definition makes two people laugh like this. Oh my goodness. This is making me have to pee.
So I was at the point where we're talking about blackness as a lens of interpretation, how it interrogates the logics of Marxism, post-colonialism, psychoanalysis, and feminism, considering their properties and assumptive logics. And that's what makes it a meta-theory, looking at their foundations, methods, form, and utility. And it does so again and again on a higher level of abstraction than the discourse and methods of theories it interrogates. Afro-pessimism is, in the main, more of a meta-theory than a theory. It is pessimistic about the claims of theories of liberation make when these theories try to explain black suffering or when they compare black suffering with the suffering of other oppressed beings. Does this by unearthing and exposing the meta-aporias. This is what I mean. Like, it's good stuff, but it's also like, what are we talking about right now? It does this by unearthing and exposing the meta-aporia strewn like landmines in what these theories of so-called universal liberation hold to be true. If, as Afropessimism argues, blacks are not human subjects, but are instead structurally inert props, implements for the execution of white and non-black fantasies and sadomasochistic pleasures, then this means that at a higher level of abstraction, the claims of universal humanity...
Sorry.
Then this means that at a higher level of abstraction, the claims of universal humanity that the above theories all subscribe to are hobbled by a meta-aporia, a contradiction that manifests whenever one looks seriously at the structure of black suffering in comparison to the presumed universal structure of all sentient beings. Again, black people embody a meta-aphoria for political thought and action. Black people are the wrench in the works. In my original hearing from that and intro to Afro-pessimism, it's like, okay, fuck it, let's burn it all then. Tell me why I care about any of this shit then.
I love that I wanted this episode so bad because 3 sentences into that definition, I blacked out. I don't care what Afropessimism is.
This Wildersonian definition of it, like, I don't...
Yes. Yeah, and I feel like that's what I was kind of thinking when I was rationalizing. I fuck with Afropessimism as a framework, but when I read this isn't... Why? Maybe to one of my critiques that I will raise more later, but the experience of understanding Afropessimism versus having it explained to you, I think are 2 very different things that matters in terms of having a theory that a lot of people will want to engage with. And whether or not theories should be invented so most people won't engage with them, I think that's arguable. It's an interesting thing to think about. My reaction to that last theory, at least, I'm like, what the heck?
I mean, we love starting things off with definitions. And I say we and being like, I love starting things off with definitions. But a lot of this shit is defined way more through its qualities and how people actually engage with it. It's important that, and I think you can speak to this too, Frank Wilderson chose a memoir and mainly pieces in like memoir as form with their political work. And that's something you've also drawn into. There's always the argument of just like, how pessimistic is just this nigga? He's just sad. Like, he starts off the book with a psychotic break. Like, that's relatable. And also because I can relate to that, I also know that other people don't go through that. But also that means that other people then don't go through whole structural breaks and then have to redefine self and community and relationships and things that are necessary to survive.
I will also say it's interesting that one, Afropessimism is a meta theory. It's a theory about a theory. I'm trying to even understand what the fuck meta means. And then on top of that, like to my point about, I like Afropessimism as a framework that I can look at the world through and understand as an individual truth, the collective truth that's shared among Black people. But I also don't like the way that it like sounds when explained by this guy. It's just interesting to think about how you make something accessible to people, why, and is a theory useful if it isn't actually something that people want to spend time engaging with, like it doesn't make them feel good. And I guess to retract to a little bit more of what Jordan was saying about looking at the qualities, I just think it's confusing that Afropessimism, it's a theory above the layer of theory, which situates everything. I appreciate it more as an individual instead of all of these academic explorations of it. Is a theory useful if it has to be transcribed through all these convoluted academic terms? Then I also think like maybe that's the interesting thing about Afropessimism to me. Can people take it back from academia? Is it possible?
So I went to Reddit to look up Afropessimism because I know other people have talked about this. So I found something on Ask Philosophy. So it says, can someone please explain Afropessimism to me and tell me how to cope with the philosophy? This is all a quote from the user Critical Past 847. So as I understand Afropessimism, it posits that Black people are constructed as an idea as non-human. The idea of Blackness was created alongside the slave trade, and Blackness meant being enslaved. Great point, because one thing I love about the academic literature around Afropessimism that's not Wilderson, like I'm not hating on Wilderson, but it's more like Hartman and other things, people doing like research and to what was going on in other parts of the world when Enlightenment was happening, when they were defining what is human, defining what they considered like Western European liberatory models of legal studies, which is different from what is now being constructed. So back to the point is, not only did European and colonial societies engage in the slave trade, so did the Arab societies. And across the world and throughout time, Black people are deemed as essentially antithetical to humanity, and the white feminists a century ago mocking the brutal horror of slavery by referring to themselves as enslaved, to Palestinians taking particular umbrance at Black Israelis. Essentially, all cultures and people are anti-Black. As an African American, this idea is making me genuinely insane, depressed, and suicidal, and is filling me with so much hatred and rage and despair. And that's the end of the post. And that was a year ago. The top comment is, I want to celebrate the rage. Rage is an appropriate reaction to dehumanization. James Baldwin quote comes to mind. To be Black in consciousness America is to be in a constant state of rage. And then they go on to talk about Afropessimism in the tradition of Wilderson is relative and not absolute. Anti-Blackness as a Western sentence is only about 600 years old. Oh no, that's older than the US.
I love that you shared that and I love that rage was a response to, as an organizer, as an anarchist, as a Black person, I think about rage and anger a lot. I think about rage and anger as a man, as a cisgender man. I think about rage and anger as a queer person, as a Black person, as a citizen. And I think about how so many of our mainstream political processes encourage us to squelch our rage, put it into certain points of our lives, cram it into all the things that we watch on TV, express our rage on social media, and where does it actually show up in our world? And if we think about anti-Blackness, global anti-Blackness, some of the easiest subjects of human rage is the Black body. It's the torture of the Black woman who was enslaved and raped and tortured. It's the child that was stolen from the womb. It's literally, if we look at the process of slavery against Black people, it became a blueprint, essentially. The fact that that is a blueprint that is traceable all around the world so fucking easily by Black people. And I also say this because I feel like I read about Afropessimism in 2016. At the end of that year, I traveled to the Philippines and I have never experienced so much anti-Blackness. And so I feel like I went to another part of the world and I realized I had it smack me in the face. It's like when Black people tell you like, oh, what did you expect going over there? Like, they don't got none of us over there. And I'm like, does that mean that I'm not a human being? And what you realize is that, to me, Afro-pessimism is a logic that looks at the systemic nature of anti-Blackness. And I think to your point of looking at the qualities of it or looking at history or like how it's not beholden to Wilderson. I'm currently teaching Lose Your Mother by Saidiya Hartman right now. And one of the things I talked about in my last lesson about that text is that I like that Hartman gets at the specifics of anti-Blackness and slavery. She talks about the shape of the cells that people were put in before they went to the door of no return. She talked about the kind of things that African tribes traded with the colonizers, like cowrie shells. She looks into archives and is specific about the silences. And I think all of that undone work is a part of how we calculate the extent of anti-Blackness. And I think if that work isn't done and we get to this better world where things are abolished, it's like, if things are epigenetic, how many generations and how much time is it going to take for Black people to heal, even in this better world? And can Afropessimism account for all of that kind of ontological terror, if I were to throw in that word? And rage to me is it's a permission. It's a permission to people who have been wronged. And I think that's so necessary in the world that we live in. And a lot of organizing is telling people, you have the permission. You can be fucking angry. And here's a process that we can, I don't want to say direct the anger, but like use that anger for something important.
This reminds me a lot of conversations we've had around reparation. I think the real Afro-pessimist comes out in that conversation when you talk about how do we truly calculate, like now and going on, like numbers to put that shit on. And to me, it's autonomy. Like, it's not a number. It's autonomy of resources, sovereignty. It's land back. I believe much more in indigenous sovereign nations' ability to govern and have more reparative justice things than I do the states when we talk about like reparation.
Yeah.
The reparations of my idea is always like the like Afro-pessimists, like burn it all. Like they like, yes, we're non-human to this like Western legalist framework. And at least in indigenous frameworks, even legally, even when they come close to like talking about state formations and courts, we take better dubs there.
Yeah. I don't want to laugh, but while you were talking, I was like, aren't Black people indigenous to other parts of the world? I don't know. And I guess maybe I'm just thinking of it in terms of, I like that you're raising that because I do think maybe this is kind of pie in the sky, but I think about the points of contact with colonization and the different parts of the world and how Afro-pessimism is a logic that doesn't account for the different points of contact in a certain way. It's saying that like anti-Blackness, I don't know, if you're saying that indigenous people are like inherently anti-Black, it's kind of like, well, there was a point of indigeneity in different parts of the world where they hadn't even come into contact with the colonizer with this anti-Black logic. So like, where does Afro-pessimism come into play with exactly the things that you're saying about land back and sovereignty and all those things? And then it is kind of like, oh, is this a theory confined to a certain period of time onward instead of trying to look at like a more universal, or not, I don't want to say universal, but like a larger kind of scope of humanity.
I like how you said point of contact, because like, what is your point of contact to Blackness then, like, when you're like engaging in Afro-pessimism? I think it's very easy because it does erase, I mean, like, at least in the book when he talks about indigenous relations, I'm sitting here like, what about the Maroons? What about the Seminoles? A lot of indigenous societies are survival tribes. A lot of them, like, not a lot, but Seminole and Lakotans had Black folks in their tribes, some as slaves, some not. Especially in like Seminole society, that changed to have more of the abolishment of slavery. I feel like it's a whole framework. Like you said, some Black folks are indigenous. Maybe they're Pan-African. There isn't, if you're already in a room full of Black people, like, it's something we can talk about. It's like Unk at the cookout, or it's a porch discussion, a conversation you have on the couch with friends. And I don't think it doesn't deserve to be in academia. I think it deserves to be studied. But I also think that entry point is so broad. Yeah. Like you said, like, anybody could have it, no matter what your point of contact is.
Yeah. I think what you're saying also kind of reminded me of 2020. Do you remember that video of all the white people kneeling and apologizing for racism while all those Black organizers were like, every white person kneel and you will apologize for white supremacy and you will commit to being a race warrior? And I guess it makes me think about, is it a theorist's job to worry about how a theory can be co-opted? No. But I do think it is interesting when a theory can believably lead to people being able to use it or think about it in this way that reduces another person's humanity, or it becomes this like spectacle or theater where you always have to be proving something, you have to validate something in this way that is like, I also think what's beautiful about radicalism and Black anarchy is I am everything all at once. Like, yeah, there's global anti-Blackness, but I could fucking punch a cop or light something on fire or write a book or do all these things where I'm doesn't fit within the boundaries of this framework. And it just makes me kind of think, okay, it's useful, but how is it uplifting or enlightening? Which I guess is important with that Reddit thread, because that guy was depressed for a year, or that person was depressed for a year. And I'm like, you need to party with us. Like, where do the Afro-pessimists party? Do they even party? That's my question.
Do Afro-pessimists fuck? Other than them fucking, some of the other qualities, some of them are broad, but some of them are very like, it takes a certain kind of radicalization. That's social death. Or talking about that anti-blackness as a foundational brick building of white society or settler society. And then even beyond that, in other societies, because then their points of contact to blackness is this global capitalist interpretation of black folks, which are objectifying or just complete stereotypes. I guess that kind of gets into the feeling of you can travel and then still sit there and feel like this blackness, at least when Saidiya Hartman's talking to it as relating to being a stranger in every place, is a permanent condition. So like this being a stranger in every place that you go and travel is the permanent condition. And it feels not like okay, I'm the stranger turned tourist or traveler or anything else. It's always having another word to call you. Like, everybody has another word that they call you. It might be behind your back. We might not even know it yet.
And I also want to add to your point about, so in Lose Your Mother, Saidiya Hartman does say like the most universal definition of the slave is a stranger. And she mentions this because she says African tribes didn't sell their brothers and sisters or whatever, or their fellow countrymen or whatever into slavery. They sold strangers. And so it is interesting, even if we're looking at different ways to analyze or define Afropessimism, we can look at how these definitions of stranger, slave, human, anti-human all became intrinsically tied to either blackness or non-blackness. And that to me is like a very other fascinating way to kind of look at it, because Lose Your Mother is just such a great, amazing text. And I think back to your point about why Wilderson engages with Afropessimism through Memoir, and also Saidiya Hartman, who's also a big theorist in the area of thought, she also engages with it in her memoir, Lose Your Mother. It's about her journey to different parts of Africa, especially Ghana, to study the transatlantic slave trade and all of the gaps in the research and the things that she's able to find and do. I think the qualities and the different ways that we can look at Afropessimism matter because they make it a more accessible argument, or they make it more possible for it to be something that different kinds of people can engage with. Because if you just say like, everyone's anti-black, like, fuck everyone, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's different than being like, how do people in different parts of the diaspora engage with Afropessimism? And does that matter even in that logic? That's another way of looking at it, even to kind of situate us in some of the bare bones qualities of Afropessimism. Here's some beats that can kind of help you understand it in different ways. One of the qualities of Afropessimism is looking at anti-blackness as foundational. Afropessimism argues that anti-blackness is not just a form of prejudice or discrimination, but it is embedded at the very core of societal structures. Another phrase that's very key to Afropessimism that was mentioned earlier is social death. This concept, developed by scholar Orlando Patterson, is adapted and expanded upon within Afropessimist thought. Social death refers to the idea that Black individuals are considered socially dead or non-human, deprived of the full range of rights and subjectivities that non-Black individuals possess. This concept underscores that the devaluation and dehumanization of Black lives in a way that extends beyond physical violence. So that's when you talk about the libidinal economy, ontological, blah, 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 blah. I think even Saidiya Hartman says like the womb is the fucking slave ship or something. And then another one is blackness as a permanent position. Afropessimism challenges the notion that progress or reform within existing systems can lead to Black liberation. Instead, it posits that blackness is a permanent condition, and attempts at integration or assimilation within existing structures will not fundamentally alter the anti-Black foundations of society. I think this one is interesting because I think about a lot. Should we have been fighting for civil rights? Should we have fought for integration? When slavery ended, why didn't we fucking not join this fucking country? You know what I mean? Where I'm like, we were enslaved, brought here, were racialized, and then through the process of achieving our human rights, our being considered humans, or humans that were worthy of segregation or whatever the fuck the state said, we entered this social contract that I think is fucked up.
I didn't enter this shit on purpose. That's one thing I hate about social contract theory. It doesn't give you a clause to get the fuck out. Another quality that folks talk about is the impossibility of black liberation and how Afropessimism is skeptical about the possibility of achieving true liberation for black individuals within the existing socio-political structures. It contends that the systems are in place and designed to maintain black people, subjugate them, and any attempts at reform are limited in their ability to address the foundational issues of anti-blackness. Liberation, according to Afropessimism, would require a radical reimagining of societal structures. And to that I always say, get in line. You're not the only motherfucker that says that. Yeah, you're telling me we gotta flip shit from the top? Okay, let's do it. I do think there is like a very precise understanding of anti-blackness that Afro-pessimism takes in. The way it digests, or how it traces the lineage of supremacist groups, and how blackness is their foundational violence. A constant punching bag, a constant other. That's fascism. That's colonialism. That's imperialism. People are just wanting to use somebody else's labor. And it's consistently been black folks.
So now to move into a new section of this episode where we talk about different ways to engage with Afropessimism, I want to read a little bit of Lose Your Mother by Saidiya Hartman. As a writer, I fucking love this book, and it's a very difficult read. I think some of it can feel very academic, some of it can feel convoluted, but I think there is such a heart to this book. I admire the way that Hartman uses research and critical fabulation and draws on a lot of this desire to examine our nostalgia as Black people for this African past or this African history. And essentially the book is her recounting different experiences from her life in the US with her family, but mostly her time in Ghana, West Africa, studying the transatlantic slave trade and confronting various levels of her own kind of illusions of the African continent and different parts of Africa like Ghana, and also African illusions about the Black American experience. It's an amazing read. Check it out. But I'm going to read the beginning of chapter 12, which is titled Fugitive Dreams. On the road to Ogwalu, the bus rippled with laughter. Our voices rushed from the windows and filled the vast expanse of unpopulated territory. Foman, a historian from Cameroon, joked that he was going to sell the Kenyans at the next stop on the slave route. He was sure he could buy enough guinea fowls to feed the entire bus if he sold Hannington, Masha, Mumbai, and Richard. Richard shouted from the back of the bus, "I'm from Uganda, remember?" Foman's joke led to the spate of others about the vices of slaves from particular countries. With Jenks, the bus reached a consensus. We couldn't expect much from him. What could you do with a Nigerian? Why would you ever want to buy such a troublesome property? Jenks retorted, a king of nothing, but a king all the same. No one made jokes about selling Sandra and me, the only African Americans in the research group, because it would have been in bad taste, like pointing out a missing limb, or poking fun at a deformity, or ridiculing the indignant, or about Jeffrey from South Africa, who evoked even more pity than we did. He had been a slave in his own country. At least we had the excuse of having been abducted. When we crossed the border into Tigo, the guys teased me saying, "Saidiya, maybe this is where you're from." In Benin, they taunted, "Shouldn't you get off the bus and try to find your roots? We will conduct the interviews while you try to figure out who you are." Richard was the worst of the bunch because he knew I was fond of him. It was the combination of his sharp wit and easy manner that I liked. He loved to mock my Swahili name. The first day in the research seminar, he had asked me if I knew what my name meant. I replied, "Of course. It means one who helps." "But what you don't know," he said, "is that you stand in the central market in Nairobi with your palms extended and say your name softly, Saidiya, Saidiya. People will think you are pleading for help and begging for alms." Hannington, who was the unrepentant Pan-Africanist of the group, looked at me with sympathy at such moments. His name was Kareem Farrakhan Jones, Richard stated, and the bus instantly erupted in laughter. Now Kareem Jones, a few more chuckles, was a slave in America who swam across the Atlantic because he wanted so badly to return home to Africa. As soon as he dragged himself onto the shore of Nigeria, he kissed the soil, but his homecoming was short-lived. He had only walked a few meters when he was captured by two bandits who, recognizing him as a stranger, the kiss had given him away, sold him into slavery. Kareem Jones was sold so many times and passed through so many hands that eventually he landed a clove plantation in Zanzibar. When he realized he would only ever be a slave in Africa, toiling away for a master who didn't call him a nigger, but who treated him like one, he jumped into the Indian Ocean and tried to swim back to the States. But unfortunately, he went down somewhere off the coast of South Africa. I didn't want to laugh, but I couldn't help it. Ibrahim, a graduate student from Senegal, ready to initiate the next round. He was a tall, lanky Wolof who had told me repeatedly that his family would never allow him to marry anyone of slave origins, although he would be permitted to have sex with me. He got as far as there was once when I piped up, enough already with the jokes about slaves, and to my surprise, the guys stopped. I chose that personally because it is honestly one of my favorite parts of the book. It is such a convergence of so many different parts of the diaspora. It's addressing a lot of awkwardness, a lot of defensiveness. And also, I mean, even the guy being like, he can't marry a girl of slave origins, but he could fuck her. I'm like, bro, it's everywhere. And I'm like, Saidiya knows how to bring out the receipts. I can say that. It's like Wilderson. They both do specifics.
I can tell you my first reaction to that was like, couldn't help but laugh, but also be like, this is just tragic. Like, this is absurd. Like, this is absurdity. Like, this is why I love, like, Afro-absurdist art or storytelling. Because I'm just like, this is, like, absurd because it is just what we go through.
The guy in there that said, we will conduct the interviews while you try to figure out who you are? That's so rude. It's like, she's literally trying to trace the violence of fucking slave history. And he's like, yeah, we'll actually get work done while you try to pontificate about some fucking identity thing. I'm like, this is actually fucking history, dude.
So then what's the African critical theory? Like, what are they working on? Why are they also in that project to interview people to trace that violence? I'm sitting there like what's motivating you?
I mean, they have entire countries, entire histories that they could pull from that's not related to the black experience of slavery. So it's just like they got their own shit. They got their own slavery to research.
So it's very much a part of the other cultures as well. I come from a tribe that was migratory. Ain't no way some of those tribe members weren't moving strangers around from another tribe to another tribe. Ain't no way. We know how to move ground. That's an integral part of then certain aspect in different societies in Africa.
I brought up Lose Your Mother because I am interested in how it talks about Afropessimism, but I feel like we should start getting into some of the critiques, some of the things that people disagree with, some of the common things that people think are just easily criticizable about Afropessimism as a line of logic.
As a revolutionary, how often do you think about this?
I think about it when I am usually way more depressed about the state of the world. When I'm happier, when I feel good about life, when I feel like I'm in control, I'm like, freedom. But when I'm like sad, or maybe I'm a little heartbroken, or I haven't had sex in a while, or I don't know, like I'm insecure, I'm always like, everyone's looking at me and the world is gonna hunt me down. And it feels very color purple. So I feel like it depends on my emotional state. When I experience racism, and I guess when I say like explicit racism, I think about it a lot in terms of like who I'm around, how they relate to it. Honestly, as someone that's traveled a lot, I also think about it a lot when I'm traveling, a lot when I'm in other parts of the world, because it is one of the few lines of logic that has helped me kind of cope with the really fucked up shit that's happened to me in other parts of the world. It's psychological, and I think Afropessimism is at least helpful when you're depressed, but when you want something that kind of can explain something so you can understand it and make sense of it and then kind of move past it. Because I don't think Afropessimism is like, I don't think about it as like a end all be all. It's more like, this is helping me process my anger, and then what am I going to do about my anger? And I think about it in a lot of those instances.
How do you feel about Afropessimism being talked about as a reduction of everyone else is just bred to hate us? And that's just easy to accept. Everyone that's non-black is bred to hate us, is essentially the argument. And is that too easy?
I think that's a very easy definition of Afropessimism. It's like, that's the most cursory way of describing it. Like, everyone hates us and they hate us. And so people that use it that way, I feel like those are like the hoteps and shit. If we're talking about like the spectrum of blackness and how it relates to Afropessimism, I think every area of the spectrum of blackness could have some way of relating to it in a way that is either like old heads being like, don't fucking trust these white folks. And then like people that are also black in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and they're like, I'm never going to date a white person ever. I won't even fuck one. I don't have white friends. Or people that are just like, I mean, white people are fucked up, but I mean, I don't really care that much like that to be complaining about all the time. There's a spectrum of how we relate to it and how it's useful, and that is what makes it so interesting beyond it means everyone hates us, because I think it's traceable in almost every area of blackness. Like even Candace Owens, I feel like, could be considered an Afro-pessimist.
There are people who know things, and you know they know things, like Pete Buttigieg. His father is like a translator. Big theorists of like Gramsci and Trotsky. Pete knows about cultural hegemony and is using it for evil. Candace Owens knows about Afro-pessimism and is using it for evil. There are people who are old comrades of a comrade of mine. They organized together. They got into Afro-pessimism. I'm gonna just say half of that group became business majors and are like, we now know how to like fuck the economy. And by fuck the economy, not in like a good way, just like fuck with the economy and really take root in marketing and take root in who your product is going to and why and how fast and in what ways and what you can afford to do in this sort of attention economy.
So is a critique you're kind of raising is that with Afro-pessimist logic, it gives black people kind of these permissions to do things politically to remove ourselves from the bottom, including like engaging in capitalism, being fucked up and contradictory and like participating. That's like that's bad.
I'm saying it helps me feel theoretical when I'm whining about racism. And it's fun and it's useful. And it's like, I feel like it is great for a dialogue. I do think about this often as an organizer. Like, I'll be in spaces, and I'll be like, especially in the Midwest, I'm like, damn. Like, I'm in the Midwest, and I'm in Columbus. I'm not in Detroit, I'm not in Chicago, I'm not in Minneapolis. We is not that black out here. So, I'm always in these positions, like, this is always then whose responsibility to do something, and to continue to organize in certain ways when in these spaces. And the disparity of treatment when working in direct aid services. Like, doing programs where, like, most people get housed, except for the 3 black people that were there longer than anyone else.
I will counterpoint by saying it's interesting that you situate where we are geographically. I didn't really know a white person until I was like 12, 13, like someone I talked to or saw all the time. And I basically say that meaning I feel like when I started to meet white people and I started to experience microaggressions and I started to experience racism in a different way, because I feel like growing up in Cleveland, only really being in the black part of the city, it was like I understood systemic racism more before I understood it intrapersonally. When I started to experience interpersonal racism in college and afterwards, Afropessimism became useful in a way. Sometimes when things happen to me, I'm angry at the person that subjected me to something that's fucked up, if it's like racism or something. But then sometimes I'm angry at myself because I feel like some part of me forgot the world is this way. You forgot, like, you dumbass bitch. It reminds me, oh yeah, this is the reality. And sometimes that's helpful, sometimes it isn't. And I guess I also want to bring up a literal experience that I think to me helped me engage with Afropessimism a lot more seriously. It's when I went to Standing Rock in 2016. And for those who don't know, Standing Rock was this big movement in 2016 to oppose the Dakota Access Pipeline, led by a bunch of indigenous people and water protectors, revolutionaries, etc. And they invited other people to kind of come there and share space. I went there and I had this jacket at the time because I loved wearing really vulgar, just intense jackets. And so it said fuck white America on the back. This was also 2016 election time. So Trump was running for president. It was interesting to me to see people engaging with fascism and being scared about it. And I was like, I'm gonna put on this fucking jacket. And then I was in Standing Rock and this indigenous man came up to me and he was like, you can't wear that. It's against our movement's message. And then he left and then he came back with 3 other people and they were like, we're going to have you followed if you keep wearing that because it's against the movement's message. And they made me take it off. Yeah, there's a lot of objective reasons why. It's like, it's not your movement. Stop wearing that shit. It's inflammatory or blah, blah, blah. It's not about you, blah, blah, blah. But in that moment, I realized, I was like, I don't get how you want me to fucking fight for your liberation if you're going to tell me what the fuck I can say and when or how I can say it. And I feel like Afro-pessimism helps me remember that sometimes, because I do think two things can be true at once. So I can also understand and believe in Afro-pessimism and also believe in the hope and all the other shit. But I do think I'm definitely a person where I need to understand the darkest version of reality in order to theorize about what the best version of it is, because that feels more honest to me. Afro-pessimism is a part of that equation for me, among other things that are more cynical that I believe in.
I also think there were people that I knew at different camps at Standing Rock that were like, have heard about that situation. They were like, those motherfuckers weren't elders. They were just older. And they were dickwads. Wish you were at our camp because you would have had a much better time.
Yeah. It was an interesting experience.
What do you feel then about the conversations around Afro-pessimism, how it taints material realities around solidarity, how people use it to sometimes turn away? I can't focus on their liberation. I'm focused on mine, and they don't pull up to our shit anyway. And other questions about the usefulness of Afro-pessimist thought.
My reaction is Afro-pessimism is best used as a point of engagement with the systems that we live in and how we relate to it, and the different ways that we can define our individual forms of oppression and give that language specifically. Because I'm very sure that there are ways that indigenous people would describe their subjugation and oppression that wouldn't include like blackness in a part of the equation, or like it's specific to them. For me as a black person, if I'm talking to someone who's sharing that about their experience, I'm personally not going to be like, oh, that's dumb. I have more pain and suffering than you do. For me, it's more about the willingness to engage in that conversation, because we have to be willing to like engage with each other's reality. That is solidarity to me. So I think people use it wrong when they're like, I don't fucking trust nobody because everybody's anti-black. To me, it's less about that being the like course of action or the logical course of action. It's more like it's a way for me to build trust with people if they're willing to engage in that conversation. Just as I would want to be challenged and engage in difficult conversations with other people's lines of logic about the ways that they're oppressed. In terms of how it can be useful for solidarity, in contrast to like how people are like, it stops solidarity. It's like, it's a way for me to build trust if like someone can engage with these more particular confusing ways of looking at oppression. I like to at least be able to have the conversation.
Do you consider yourself an Afro-pessimist?
I feel like the FBI's listening. I would call myself an Afro-dualist.
No one else can see the glory of Prince's smile when he said that. But it was beautiful. What does an Afro-dualist mean to you then?
To me, it involves understanding Afro-pessimism, seeing it as entirely rational, but also being like, yeah, but there's all these other things to think about and consider that are like kind of more fun and interesting and make you feel more connected to the world that you live in. And I feel like it's important to understand disassociation just as well as how we engage with the world and feel like we're a part of it meaningfully. And I feel like that's what liberatory political processes are. Yeah, Afro-pessimism can be considered radical, but to me, it's like not enough for me to claim it as like a central point of identity. It's more of like a little appendage that got thrown on there.
And I think that makes sense because what is it again, gang? A meta theory.
Yeah.
So it is less something to be ascribed to and more something to discuss and something to use to shape discussion. Its central points are those central anti-blackness, the general social death. I mean, what it really comes down to is relations to property, relations to then not only owning property, but being owned as property, and that being a global understanding of blackness, that proximity of being owned. It's also certain images that get portrayed in the global media of black peoples whose faces are right next to corporations consistently selling something. And it might even be a fantasy in foreign movies, and that's like people's relationship to blackness. I think there's something trending a while ago. We're talking about like French people say nigga a lot. So do East Asians. So do Southeast Asians. The cultural sharing is like engaging and consuming black media that becomes popular enough to then, at least back in the day with the internet, it's changed a bit more. But back in the day, you could only just see what had the most money behind it to travel global.
I'm going to plug my book. I wrote a book. It's called When They Tell You to Be Good. And literally, I'm remembering one of the points of logic that I wrote my book through was Afro-pessimism. And it was because it helped me talk about the experiences I had while traveling. I talk about a lot in the book. There's a whole chapter about it. I went to the Philippines in 2017. This was around the time of the presidential election, all that other. But I went to the Philippines. What really helped me understand my experience there was one of Frank B. Wilderson's writings, where he talks about a part of Afropessimism and anti-Blackness is negrophobia and negrophilia. Negrophobia is a fear of Blackness. Negrophilia is a fascination of Blackness. I read that before I went to the Philippines. And when I went to the Philippines, within a block of walking down the street, I could have all of the people on that street stare at me. One person could point at my nose and laugh. A teenage boy could follow me for most of the block and demand I take photos with him. And it was just like the extremity of the different reactions I experienced to Blackness and the commonplaceness of that. This is also, honestly, this is an Afro-pessimist image. I was so fucking angry the whole time I was in the Philippines. Kids would come up to me and point and laugh, and they pull on my hair. Women would be like, is your hair a wig? Because I had dreads at the time. Women would like proposition me in weird ways. You're walking and people keep staring at you and they keep laughing. And you're like, I'm gonna fucking pop the next kid that comes up to me. And it was a lot. And I remember talking to my black friend about it. And he was like, oh, well, I went there. And one thing that really helped me was doing this volunteer trip where I went to this indigenous community. And I went to this indigenous community. It was like some kind of like nonprofit. All these kids wearing rags. They barely had any clothes. And all these little indigenous kids were pointing at me and laughing the whole time I was there. And all these Filipinos were just like, and I just kept thinking like, what the fuck is this supposed to mean? Because I'm an American. I have privilege. I know that this is fucking, but then I was like, these kids literally know to point and laugh at me because I'm darker than them. So what the fuck?
Colorism is global also because like that, in like any society, if you were outside longer, you worked more. You were a laborer.
So it's an economic relation that manifests itself as like a racialized terror.
That's what gets me in the Afropessimism.
I was like, I never known anybody that seen something like this. What did I do?
What did you say?
I said I never knew someone that does see something like this. I never knew something that seen somebody like that. Oh, yeah. Wow. This is more than a mini episode, but that's okay.
Are there any closing notes?
I think Afropessimism extremely interesting. It's extremely useful. I think it's cool to talk about. I think it's kind of shocking. It's jarring. But I think on a deeper sort of emotional level, even as a writer, I would never end a narrative with an Afro-pessimist logic. I would probably start it there because it feels like a restriction. It feels like something that defines the conditions for you and doesn't really help you reach out past it. But I also think within Afro-pessimism and how it's been developing, and even reading Saidiya Hartman and other writers, there are forms of looking at Blackness and anti-Blackness and Afro-pessimism that allow us to critically fabulate, to imagine things, to envision some of the answers that I think Afro-pessimism tries to give us, but in a more pessimistic way, and we can find more hopeful answers. And I feel like that's where I want more. I don't want to be told, you're at the bottom, like the world is anti-Black. I want to be told, yeah, that's true, but you can still live a good life and believe things and resist. Yeah, it's going to be fucked up, but also you're fucking great. And I wish there was like more of that in Afro-pessimism, where it's like, you're a boss ass bitch. Your people done survived. They got up at crack of dawn. They went down after the sun went. To me, it's just like there's so much survival and power in Blackness that I think Afro-pessimism kind of undercuts in a way. And I don't like that.
So how do you feel about Hartman's use of critical fabulation and the use of storytelling, speculation, narrative as a means of redressing history's omissions?
I think it's amazing. I think it's like in the spirit of like Toni Morrison and Audre Lorde and all these other amazing Black feminists that do things that innovate the way that we look at the world. And it becomes kind of like, to me, it's almost like a gift, because I relate to it very personally, where it's like, there are people in my family who are dead and they were undocumented and there are all these things I won't know about them. There are these tools given to me by these Black feminists, by these theorists that allow me to find answers that the record or even what the world says is logic. No, I have another way. I have another reason to be fucking angry, and I have another reason to act, and I also have another reason to say I'm angry, but also I want to live. It's all a part of that cycle, and I think critical fabulation is a tool in that overall kind of toolkit, and I love it, and I write towards it.
And I think that also places it again as like a meta theory, especially as like a creative tool, because that's where it can come into like the cultural work and like the cultural revolutions that we want to do. Is taking these perspectives and really applying them and unapplying them over and over again to see what we can create and make and have it be inspired by the things around us and hopefully inspire them as well. That reminds me of nihilism. And especially the early nihilist writers in Russia that used to throw bombs at kings. One of them, who inspired a lot of this nihilist shit, at least writing-wise, had a notebook and a journal that they kept for one of their characters to express the world around them and their relations to it. They wrote through this nihilist character's lens, like a journal. That's not their full lens. And it's just like one way to encapsulate the realities and different potentials and different perspectives. A lot of the same with Afro-absurdism, which is a lot of post-ironic shit. A lot of it is just, this is our day-to-day, this is life.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Dugout. I really enjoyed this discussion about Afropessimism. I think it's a fascinating line of logic that brings up a lot of interesting distinctions, especially for people within the diaspora. How do we relate to each other? How do we engage in these conversations? And I think these thought processes are ongoing, and it's a part of any kind of decolonial, like revolutionaries thought process in general. We have so many things that we mentioned in this episode, and all of the media mentioned is going to be in the show notes. So definitely check out some of the writings or especially the books that were mentioned. I would recommend Lose Your Mother by Saidiya Hartman. I think it's amazing. And I would also recommend Afro-pessimism.
So one thing I wanted to talk about before we ended this off was some action items that folks can take from this, which is like responsibilities that folks might have that can break certain Afro-pessimist qualities that make them so real in our day-to-day lives. As someone who is second-generation immigrant from West Africa, the whole tribalism and having the idea of the stranger, the lower caste, I think the responsibility to break that is on folks who have that relation. And I think that's why it is important for some people, especially who have this Afro-pessimist lens, or at least people who come across it, especially me, when in like going through decolonial lenses. What did it give? What can we take? And then what can be recycled? And what like do we not care about? But also, what did it enlighten, like as an issue?
And if you wish to support The Dugout, please find us on Substack, where you can support us with paid subscriptions. We edit these episodes ourselves. We record them ourselves. We do all the research. We curate the show notes. All of this is time that we take out of our days, of course, because we love talking about revolutionary things. But if you want to support the podcast, check us out on Substack. All of that will be in our podcast descriptions, and you can find so many other things on Substack as well, because we upload all sorts of resources on all the topics that we talk about.
Mm-hmm.